Criminal probes, lawsuits, endless finger-pointing, and billions billed to customers. It's been 4 years since a radiation leak forced the closure of the San Onofre nuclear plant, and we still wonder who was looking out for the public interest. State regulators, the governor's office, the California Attorney General, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission all seem to have been missing in action. I'm Mark Sauer. We'll take a look at who's accountable for this radioactive mess on this special edition of the Roundtable, starting now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the Roundtable today are KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma. Hi, Amitha.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you back again. Producer J.W. August of NBC7 News. Hi, J.W.
Hey, Mark.
Glad to have you here today. And reporter Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union Tribune's Watchdog team. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Mark.
Glad to have you back. Well, first came news of faulting cooling tubes and radiation leaks, then the real stunner, the decades-old San Onofre nuclear generating station would have to shut down. Now, that was 4 years ago this month, and news stories about who's paying for all of this have featured much intrigue, outrage, and probing questions, but not much accountability. Here's consumer advocate Charles Langley saying what he really thinks about the settlement that will cost ratepayers billions of dollars.
I think customers have been completely betrayed. As customers, we've been screwed straight into the ground. The Public Utilities Commission has completely failed to protect us. They're charging us for costs we should never be forced to pay. It is theft. Absolutely. This was an unlawful taking of our money. They're forcing us to pay for these failed experimental generators, these souped-up generators that they put in. And they did it for profit. You know, what they tried to do is squeeze every last ounce of energy they could get out of these generators, and they knew they were endangering lives.
Well, he doesn't sugarcoat that much, Amitha. Remind us specifically back when, 4 years ago, what caused that plant to shut down in 2012?
Well, there was a radioactive leak, and that leak led to the discovery of excessive tube wear on hundreds of steam generator tubes that basically carry the radioactive water.
And again, this was all fairly new equipment, right?
It was 11 months old, and those steam generators were supposed to last 40 years.
Okay, and it was the vibrations was what caused those leaks and those tubes to wear so quickly?
It was steam traveling through the generators that was simply too hot, and there was a vibration, but it was also wearing down the tubes.
All right, so there are both state, federal regulations supposedly safeguarding public safety when it comes to these plants. Let's start with the state. What is the role of the CPCU, that's the California Public Utility Commission here?
Well, they regulate energy companies, private utilities. They also regulate telecommunications, rail transit, and I think a little bit of water. And their job is basically to ensure that all of us get safe, reliable electricity at reasonable rates.
Okay, and who are the folks on this commission? What sorts of people are?
Well, so there are 5 commissioners, and they're appointed by Governor Brown, and the head of the commission is a gentleman by the name of Michael Picker, and he's actually a former renewable energy advisor to Governor Brown. The other 4 are all lawyers. One of them used to work at a consumer advocacy group known as TURN from Northern California, and I think the 3 others have worked in energy public interest law for a while. So, but in the past, I mean, there have been quite a few people from the energy industry, one of them being the former head of the commission, Michael Peavy, who once headed Edison.
And we're going to get into a lot of that as we move on through this show. So the CPUC oversaw this multi-billion-dollar deal, assigns costs for the shutdown of San Onofre between utility customers and company shareholders, the stockholders here. So what's the basic breakdown, and how much was the deal, and what's the breakdown?
So it's a $4.7 billion deal. Customers picked up, or are picking up, 70% of those costs, which amounts to $3.3 billion, and the utilities are absorbing $1.4 billion of the costs.
Okay. Now, we had consumer groups involved in the negotiations. Jeff, the original groups who were supposed to be looking out for the public interest in this deal, they've backed away from this thing now, right?
Yes, curiously they have. They decided it's maybe not such a good deal for the ratepayers. I should say that when they announced announced the deal, they framed it and billed it as a $1.4 billion rebate for customers.
Right.
Oh, yes.
So that was their first press release.
Right.
It's a great press release to read now in hindsight. You look at it, what? Who are they selling this to?
Yeah, so we're getting all this money back, but that wasn't the case at all.
No, so they made this agreement in 2013 and 2014 over about a year period. Subsequent to that, the deal got approved by the PUC. And after that, when more revelations came out about the secret meetings that led to the deal, the Office of Ratepayer Advocates, a division of the PUC, and TURN, the Utility Reform Network Consumer Group, they both repudiated the deal they had signed on to.
All right, JW?
And the whole problem started with the way the entire industry is run by the NRC, which is more of a nuclear regulatory
the federal agency,
right.
yeah, we should be clear on that.
Some say it's more of a lapdog than a watchdog. But the rules are such that the utilities decide if they want to do a remodel. They don't have to go to the city to get a permit. The utilities themselves decide how much of a change is from the regular maintenance of the facility, how different it is than anything done before. And so SCE, in order not to have people looking over their backs and seeing what they're doing, said, oh, this is not a big deal, this steam generator. When in fact this steam generator was the biggest Mitsubishi ever made. If you look at the profile of it, most steam generators, if they were an SUV, this thing was a Peterbilt. It was a monster generator. They had never done it before. The government should have been looking over the back, but SCE said, no, it's not a big deal.
Right. You mentioned the permit. I should say they had to go to the feds for the permit, and they wanted to avoid that very costly, time-consuming permit
They didn't want
process.
that looked into.
Right.
And they were the largest steam generators ever built in the United States
Right.
at that time.
Right.
It was a monster.
And so they really shortcutted that, and as you say, it's the utility who makes that call, and that's coming back to bite everybody.
And it's all about money, right? The bigger it is, the more the
There's a
steam.
lot of money at stake, yes.
Well, let's circle back now. You mentioned these secret meetings. I want to talk about your reporting on that secret meeting. What did you learn about what went on in Warsaw, Poland between Edison officials, that's, of course, the utility controls the failed nuclear plant, and the head of the CPUC?
The Public Utilities Commission has been under investigation for its dealings in San Bruno, where a pipeline exploded 5 years ago. So as part of that investigation, that's a Pacific Gas and Electric asset. And so the regulators were being investigated for their handling of PG&E and their lack of oversight of that utility. In the course of investigating PG&E, they searched Michael Peavy's house a year ago. In his home.
And again, tell us who Michael Peavy was.
Michael Peavy is the former president of the Public Utilities Commission.
The head watchdog, is
right. They found in his home some notes that were RSG notes on Hotel Bristol stationery. It's now somewhat infamous. And they recorded that. The search warrant affidavit was kept secret, but on the returns where they list what they seized during the search, I got a copy of those a couple days after the search was effected. And I noticed it said RSG notes, and I said that has to stand for replacement steam generators, which is the San Onofre project. So what that did is it linked the investigation of PG&E and the PUC up in San Francisco in the Bay Area to San Onofre for the first time. So we wrote about that. And within about a week after that, within about a week, or I think it was 8 or 9 days, Edison filed a disclosure of a ex parte communication, is what they're called, where Edison executive had met with Mr. Peavy in Warsaw, Poland, nearly 2 years earlier, where they sketched out a framework for a deal. Edison never told anybody about that meeting in public.
And what was the reason? Right? What was the reason that they gave for filing that ex parte notice when they did?
They said they'd come into some new information, and the Edison executive in question, a man named Stephen Pickett, had approached them about some new information that he'd recently learned. I suspect it was our report on the
they read the UT. It's good to hear that.
Well, yeah, as you were noting, they're supposed to disclose this fairly promptly.
5
if you're
days.
going to have the secret meeting.
Oh, is it 3 days?
3 days. And as you say, it was a couple of years.
Yeah, the idea is so everybody involved in the proceeding is on the same page and has equal access to the commissioners.
Right. Now, is this criminal?
Yes.
To have these secret meetings
according
and not
to the
discuss-
judge who signed the warrants, yes.
Not the actual discussion, but not the
Right.
act, but the discussion of how they were going to do it. It's the felony part,
And
right? Yeah.
the utility has been punished for conducting these ex parte communications. They were recently fined $17 million for a series of improper communications, or wrong, not disclosing the
peanuts.
Not disclosing.
So what's fascinating about all of this is in the past several months, several emails have trickled out, courtesy Mike Aguirre, the consumer lawyer, former city attorney of San Diego, who's really pushed hard on this issue. Anyway, so all of these emails have trickled out, and they have filled in so many blanks in how this all unfolded. And so soon after the PUC announced its investigation in October of 2012, its investigation of what went wrong at San Onofre, the judge at the PUC, her name is Melanie Darling, she was put in charge of overseeing this investigation.
Administrative law judge.
She's an administrative law judge, right. She starts privately communicating with a manager by the name of Russell Worden at Southern California Edison, and she learns of the existence of this very incriminating report known as the Mitsubishi root cause analysis. And that report says the following. It says that designers of those faulty steam generators knew that there were flaws, they wanted to make fixes, but they refrained from doing so in part because Edison didn't want to make the changes because they didn't want to go through that federal amendment licensing process that J.W. August referred to. And so Melanie Darling does something very interesting. She says, well, is this report going to be made public? And then she does something else that's very interesting. She delays the heart of the investigation by 2 years. Contrast that with what happened 2 months later when Senator Barbara Boxer learns of that same report. She immediately calls on federal regulators, the NRC, to open an investigation, and she calls on them to make that report public. And after she does that, there are all these email exchanges at the PUC and at Edison, and they make plans to go to Poland. And then in Poland, we know what happens.
What happened there? Well, I wanted to mention, too, that you reported State Attorney General Kamala Harris is conducting a criminal probe of that secret meeting with Michael Peavy and the Edison execs, right? What's going on with that?
We know that from the warrants. Recently, they did release one of the affidavits for a subsequent warrant, and that was the first time the whole narrative had been laid out in a public document. And I got that last month and was able to stitch together a story kind of explaining what the agents think, what the prosecutor thinks, and we reported all that. There wasn't a lot of news in there. There were some new communications and new suspicions, but it was the first time a government document spelled out exactly the theory of the alleged crime. So we'll see what happens with that, whether charges are
And it was interesting, Jeff's story, he talked about there's 1,300 different emails they're looking at, they're still looking at now. And the state went to Microsoft. They didn't go to the players because I frankly don't think they trusted them to provide the information, even if they got a subpoena for it. So they went to Microsoft and got it off the server.
Right.
And got all the emails from all of these characters involved in this
drama. They didn't want the subjects to go and delete their work.
And in fact, the PUC has not produced all the records that Kamala Harris has asked for. Now, what remains a mystery is why Kamala Harris hasn't gone to court and forced the matter and forced the PUC to turn over those documents.
Well, you brought up a lovely segue here. Well, we're going to get another bite here from consumer advocate Charles Langway. He had some choice words about the CPUC and how they approach regulation. Let's hear that.
The utilities are calling all the shots at the Public Utilities Commission. So instead of cops on the beat that are looking out to protect ratepayers from predatory utilities, which utilities want to make as much money as they can, it's more as though the governor's appointed John Gotti to the Organized Crime Task Force. I mean, we literally had a former president of Southern California Edison intervening on a rate case to decide what the bailout for San Onofre would be to Southern California Edison. And the Public Utilities Commission took care of Southern California Edison's shareholders.
All right, so what is Edison's response to all of this? They did, as we said, disclose that secret meeting ultimately, but what's their response been to all of this stuff?
They said they should have disclosed it in retrospect, in hindsight, and but the deal should stand. It was fairly negotiated, and it's a good deal for consumers. That's their position.
And Mr. Peavy's response, and when remind us when he left the PUC?
He decided not to seek a third 6-year term,
okay.
late 2014,
Okay.
and he hasn't said anything publicly that I'm aware of. I've reached out to him numerous times, and many people I know have reached out for him.
All right, Jeremy?
And I think one of you guys reported that the judge, the administrative law judge, has resigned.
She resigned this
Judge
month.
Darling.
Christmas Day was her
Yes.
last day at the commission.
Interesting.
All right,
They
well,
announced it this month, right?
let's, and for the record, let's do a little housekeeping here. What was the deal that PV in Southern California, Edison, came up with there in Poland?
The deal sketched out there are a number of issues that had to be decided on what costs are going to be borne by ratepayers, what costs will be borne by shareholders, and I'm talking about replacement fuel costs. At what point the replacement steam generators would stop being recoverable from customers. Other equipment, then when they decided to shut down the plant, operations and maintenance costs, and because the plant was supposed to be in use for years more, they'd been guaranteed a rate of return, and the utilities' argument was, hey, we invested all this money, maybe we don't get our double-digit guaranteed return. They lowered that to like 2 or 3%. So they're still making a profit on everything they invested into the plant over many decades. Those costs were totaled up roughly about $4.8 billion. The consumers were stuck with 70% of that, about $3.3 billion.
All right, I do want to shift gears a little bit here. Now, let's talk about federal oversight. Now, Amitha, what is the role of the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, regarding this shutdown and the oversight of
Well, they are the federal watchdog agency in charge of ensuring that nuclear power plants in this country run safely. Now, the NRC cited Edison for failing to verify the adequacy of the design of those steam generators. And the NRC basically said, as a result, there was significant and unexpected tube wear after just 11 months of operation. And as we discussed earlier, those steam generators were supposed to last 40 years. So 11 months later, January 2012, tube wear causes a radioactive leak. June 2013, the plant is shut down permanently. At the end of the day, the NRC issues a notice of violation to Edison that carries no fines and it carries no penalties.
So, critics and experts have pointed out that the NRC was left in the dark during this 2006 meeting about the new steam generators.
So back in 2006, June of 2006, managers from Edison met with NRC officials. It was considered a high-level meeting back east to discuss these new steam generators. In the year and a half before that June 2006 meeting, Edison was put on notice of that potential design flaw, which was basically
Put on notice by they themselves discovered it because they were part of that design team, and by Mitsubishi. So the manufacturer
So they knew that steam too hot to travel would be going through that equipment and could potentially cause tube wear. Again, the very problem that caused the leak and the shutdown. But they never mentioned it to NRC officials during that June 2006 meeting.
It may be worse than that. They didn't just not mention stuff. They actually said it would be an improved design over what they were replacing. That the new steam generators would be an improved model, even though they were untested. So that may be more of a sin of...
Well, all right, and there is that, but doesn't the NRC see this as a big deal? We really should require this permit and this deep dive that wasn't done?
Well, you know, it's hard to say because the NRC
Hindsight's easier.
Well, the NRC never returned a phone call regarding how they characterized what Edison did or did not do. I spoke with a gentleman by the name of Daniel Hirsch, who's a nuclear policy expert, and he said, look, NRC rules equate omissions like this with lying, and he was hugely critical of the well, not just of Edison for leaving out the information, but hugely critical of the NRC for not dinging Edison for this omission. And he said it basically undermines their credibility to enforce any kind of safety regulation at the other nuclear plants in the country.
So again, though, as they finally, in hindsight, realized this omission and what had gone on, but no fines and nothing much really happened, right?
But again, as Jeff said, it actually gets worse than that because the Office of Inspector General at the NRC investigated the NRC's inquiry into what happened at San Onofre. And they also did not chastise the NRC for not calling out Edison for that 2006 emission.
All right,
We would get more trouble with a car that wasn't legally smogged, and those guys have done with billions of dollars and our lives and our safety.
Well, let's circle back to Senator Barbara Boxer. She did get involved here, and she got leaked some documents here, and kind of was aghast, if that's the right word, at this. And what did she do in terms of a criminal look at all of this?
Well, she asked the Justice Department to open a criminal investigation in May of 2013. It's not clear if the Justice Department ever did that. An official from there refused to comment on whether this investigation or any kind of investigation was ever opened.
All right. Any reason why Boxer hasn't followed up on that or put her foot
well, I
to the
think
throat?
she's on the way out
that's true.
at the U.S. Senate, so it may not
other
be a
senator
priority.
doesn't
But
care.
she still had another 2
Weinstein
years
doesn't
after that happened. And I
Right.
think, you know, I don't know this as a fact, but I do think that there's a sense of, well, the plan to shut down. So everything is done and taken care of, but that's actually not the case.
Well, that's another nice segue here. You must be in the broadcasting business. Let's turn now to the nuclear plant site itself. JW had stories recently saying the Navy, which leases the San Onofre site to the utilities, is concerned that the land itself may be contaminated. This is aside from the nuclear waste issue on
We're
site.
not talking about the reactors. We're talking about the land surrounding it.
Right.
And the stories have dealt with older NRC reports, inspection reports showed them moving radioactive materials, machines, et cetera, that got exposed, and then putting them on property across the freeway from the plant.
Let's cite this. I think
burying it.
most people who live here know where this is, but there's two giant concrete domes there as you're driving
on
up
the
to
left,
Los Angeles.
and if you're going up to LA on the right is what's called Japanese Mesa.
Okay.
And that was 135 acres.
Big overlook of the ocean up there.
Yes, and that's where they were moving this stuff over to. Okay. And that's where a lot of the questions regarding that property. And that's what our stories were looking at, because the sources we had on the story were saying the utility's not being forthcoming. They're not telling us what's going on. We've been talking to them 2 years and we're no closer together. And they were, the people from the people that had an interest in this were frustrated by it, and that's how we got called into it.
Okay, so they do samples of soil samples and testing of
Right,
this
and one of the
land.
things they found, there's something, I have a thing called, it's a 900-page, it's called the Mesa Radiological Report, 900 pages, prepared by SCE, which basically says the land is clean.
So
the
Edison
Navy-
says the land is clean.
Right, and it's signed by Edison people or contractors working for Edison. And it details some of these things from the NRC report back in the 80s where they're moving this stuff onto the land. And they go
So
from,
this would have been equipment that was exposed to radiation and that
Correct.
could have transferred.
well, and there's
it
a last
to the land.
story we did. Specifically, they had the equivalent of 355-gallon drums of contaminated soil that they had dug away from around a reactor and then moved it and buried it on the property across the freeway.
This Japanese Mesa you're talking
Right.
about.
And when I ask them, nobody knows what happened to it.
Well, what is Edison's response to all of this?
They have, they don't respond to my specific questions.
They don't
I'll
respond.
just leave it at that.
All right.
But they have sent some pretty, there's an oversight committee in the community involving all the mayors and a number of entities that the SCE is supposed to go in and tell them what's going on. They have these hearings up in Oceanside. And after we did the stories, what SCE did was send a letter to them saying our story was completely wrong, we don't know anything about nuclear energy, and the land is clean. And when in fact the Navy, letter that we got from the Navy says we're not so sure the land is clean.
Yeah, so what is the Navy saying? As we say, they own this land, they lease it out here, and this is presumably very profitable
Pristine,
and
profit.
expensive land at some point. When
They want to return it in the condition in which they leased it to the utility.
that was the agreement. They
Yeah,
want it back
absolutely.
clean.
And the utility is backpedaling because they know if they start looking around, I think they know. And in this 900-page report, what the utility did when they provided samples of the soil, when they would test different places, what they did is they would, their initial samples would show higher levels, so they took 4 or 5 samples and mixed them together,
And did more
and they
of an
provided that in order to get a
to get
lower
lower threshold. Yeah.
Right, and
Now you've got a source.
Hirsch.
You got a source who has told you that.
No, it's right in the docs.
I see. Okay.
And it was a Navy environmentalist who's attached to this group that found this. But Hirsch said, who you talked to, Dan Hirsch, said that that's pretty common the way the utilities, the nuclear industry does this. They'll mix the samples together in order to get a lower reading.
That's their method of doing it. All right, we got a short time left here in the show. Let's go around here. What are you expecting here in 2016 regarding the PUC, the Governor's Office, the NRC, everyone we talked about, and taking a look at this?
Jeff and I were just talking about this. You know, there's a lot going on with that gas leak in LA County.
Right, the methane leak.
With the methane leak. And, you know, the PUC, it looks like, may have dropped the ball on that as well. And now there was a big report yesterday from a watchdog group on this very issue. And, you know, all 3 counties have been touched by quote-unquote ineptitude by the PUC.
3 Southern California counties.
Well, no, Northern California too. You have the San Bruno gas explosion back in 2010. You have the San Onofre issue, and now you have this Porter Ranch issue in LA County.
Right.
So we were just talking, we're wondering if this might be the tipping point for reform at the PUC. However, there was that big reform package that the state legislature passed last year that the governor vetoed.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time, but I look forward to a lot more reporting from the 3 of you and more segments on the Roundtable as we move forward with San Onofre and all these issues we talked about. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Amitha Sharma of KPBS News, J.W. August of NBC7 News, and Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union Tribune. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.